The neon sign of the Crossroads Diner flickered against the darkening Ohio sky, casting alternating shadows of red and blue across the rain-slicked asphalt of the parking lot. It was 1984, and places like this were becoming relics of a different America, one that was rapidly fading into memory. The building itself stood defiant against time, its metal siding weathered but proud windows gleaming with warm light that promised sanctuary from the coming storm. The distinctive rumble of a Harley-Davidson FXR filled the evening air, its throaty exhaust note echoing off the surrounding trees as it approached. The motorcycle slowed its single headlight, illuminating raindrops that now fell steadily. The rider guided the machine with practiced precision into a parking space near the entrance, the V-twin engine settling into a steady idle before falling silent. Jack Lawson sat motionless for a moment, his weathered hands still gripping the handlebars. At 62, his body reminded him daily of everything it had endured. 4 years in a Korean prison camp, 3 decades of wandering, a lifetime of regret. He removed his helmet, revealing a face that told its own story. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a guard who'd taken particular dislike to him. His silver-gray beard was neatly trimmed, contrasting with the wild silver hair that fell to his shoulders. His eyes, though, those were what people noticed. Steel blue alert, constantly scanning. The eyes of a man who had learned the hard way that survival meant never letting your guard down. Jack swung his leg over the motorcycle with the fluid motion of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in the saddle. He stood for a moment, stretching his back, surveying the parking lot with an automatic sweep that had become second nature. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against his leather jacket. The same shot perfecto he'd owned since 1975. He reached into the saddlebag and removed a wooden box about the size of a cigar container, tucking it inside his jacket. The diner's door opened with a cheerful bell that belied the gravity of Jack's mission. Inside, the warmth hit him first, then the smells: coffee-grilled onions, fresh pie. The jukebox played Johnny Cash's "I Walk the Line," the man in black's deep voice filling the room. Several patrons turned to look at the newcomer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to caution as they took in his appearance. Jack stood at the entrance water, dripping from his jacket onto the checkered floor. His eyes adjusted to the light, automatically noting exits positions of the other customers. Potential threats. Old habits. The diner was decorated in classic 1950s style. Red vinyl booths, chrome trim, black and white photographs on the walls. One photo in particular caught his attention: a group of young men in military uniforms standing before a helicopter. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized 3 faces among them. He moved toward the counter, his boots making little sound despite his size. A man his age shouldn't be able to move that quietly. The few customers, mostly older men nursing coffee and a pair of truck drivers finishing late dinners, watched him with sideways glances. A stranger in a small town always drew attention. A stranger who moved like Jack drew concern. He took a seat at the counter, placing the wooden box carefully before him. The waitress approached, a woman in her late 50s, her brown hair streaked with gray, pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Margaret. Her eyes were tired but kind, her movements efficient from decades of practice. "Coffee, please, black." Jack set his voice a low rumble that hadn't been used much lately. Margaret nodded and reached for the pot. "You passing through or staying a while?" Her tone was conversational but cautious. Jack's eyes moved to the photograph on the wall again. "Depends on what I find," he answered cryptically. She followed his gaze to the photograph and froze, the coffee pot suspended in midair. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, then wariness. "You knew them," she said, not a question. Jack nodded once. "Frank Miller? Is he around?" The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. She set it down without pouring. "Frank passed away 3 months ago. Car accident." Her voice held steady, but her eyes told a different story. "I'm his wife, Margaret Miller." The news hit Jack like a physical blow, though his expression betrayed nothing. 11 years too late, again. He looked down at the wooden box, then back to Margaret. "I'm sorry to hear that. Frank was a good man." "You're him, aren't you?" Margaret leaned forward, studying his face. "Jack Lawson, the one who never came back." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Frank mentioned me many times." She finally poured his coffee, her composure regained. He always said if Jack Lawson ever walked through that door, I should listen to whatever he had to say. She glanced around the nearly empty diner. My shift ends in 20 minutes. Whatever brought you here after all this time must be important. Jack took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. It is. Margaret moved away to tend to her other customers, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and the wooden box. He ran his fingers over the smooth oak surface, remembering the day Frank had carved it sitting outside their tent in the Korean jungle. They'd been young then, barely out of their teens, special forces operators on a mission that would change their lives forever. He opened the box carefully. Inside lay a purple heart medal and a folded yellowed letter. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, postmarked the day before Frank died. 11 years after Jack had been declared dead, then miraculously returned from a POW camp that officially didn't exist. 11 years after he discovered his wife had remarried, believing the Army's assurances that he was gone. 11 years of drifting from town to town on his Harley, taking mechanic jobs when money ran low, never staying long enough to form connections. And now Frank was calling him home from beyond the grave. The bell above the door jingled, drawing Jack's attention. 3 men entered, shaking rain from their coats. The leader was a man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit despite the late hour and casual setting. Silver-haired tan with the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him stood 2 younger men with the unmistakable bearing of hired muscle, one a former boxer by the look of his flattened nose, the other with military-style haircut and posture. Jack knew the older man immediately, though it had been over 40 years since they'd last spoken. Maxwell Bennett, once their high school's golden boy football star and class president, now judging by his clothes and entourage, a man of considerable influence. Several emotions crossed Bennett's face as he noticed Jack. Surprise, recognition, then something harder to read. Calculation, perhaps. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached. Well, look who's risen from the dead, Bennett said, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to boardrooms and country clubs. Jack Lawson, the hometown hero, returns at last. Jack didn't stand or offer his hand. Maxwell, Bennett chuckled, turning to his companions. Jack here was the toughest kid in Riverdale High, weren't you, Jack, before you and Frank went off to play soldier? He turned back to Jack. Though I heard you got more than you bargained for over there. Jack remained expressionless, but his right hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup. Margaret had emerged from the kitchen, her face tense as she observed the interaction. I'm looking for Maggie Miller, Bennett said to her, his tone shifting to businesslike efficiency. I believe we had an appointment. We don't have an appointment, Mr. Bennett, Margaret replied, her voice cooler than when she'd addressed Jack. I told your secretary yesterday that I needed more time to consider your offer. Bennett's smile tightened. Time is money, Maggie, and frankly, this place isn't worth what I'm offering. The highway project breaks ground in 3 months, and this property will be worth half what I'm offering once construction starts. I'm doing you a favor. Jack observed the exchange, silently pieces falling into place. The Interstate Commerce Project. Mishar Siam. Frank had mentioned it in his letter. The answer is still no, Margaret said firmly. This diner was Frank's life. It's my son's inheritance. Speaking of your son, Bennett said, his tone taking on a subtle edge. How is Michael finding his job at the gas station? I hear he's hoping for that engineering scholarship to state. The implied threat hung in the air. Jack caught Margaret's eye briefly, saw the flash of worry there. From the kitchen doorway, a young man of about 18 appeared, tall and lean, with Frank's build and dark hair, wearing a cook's apron. He wiped his hands nervously on a towel as he assessed the situation. Mom, everything okay? He asked, eyes darting between Bennett and his mother. Everything's fine, Michael, Margaret assured him, though her voice lacked conviction. One of Bennett's men, the one with the boxer's nose, nudged his employer and nodded toward Jack, muttering something. Bennett's expression shifted as he took a closer look at the wooden box and the purple metal visible inside. Still carrying around old war souvenirs, Jack? Bennett asked, his tone mockingly sympathetic. Some of us moved on, built something of ourselves. This town, for instance. Riverdale Development Corporation has transformed this dying farm community into a future commercial hub. He gestured expansively. But progress requires change. Some old establishments need to make way. Jack finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying clearly in the now silent diner. Some things shouldn't change, Max, like respecting a widow's wishes. Bennett's smile vanished. The boxer-nosed man stepped forward, his stance aggressive. You got something to say to Mr. Bennett, old man? Jack didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained fixed on Bennett, steady and unblinking. This conversation isn't with you. The man reached out to grab Jack's shoulder. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers would have had difficulty describing it. Jack's hands shot up, locked around the man's wrist, and applied precise pressure to a nerve point. The larger man froze, a look of shock and pain crossing his face. Ray doesn't like disrespect, Bennett said, appearing unfazed by his employee's predicament. Neither do I. Jack released the man's wrist with a slight twist that caused him to stumble backward. That wasn't disrespect, just establishing boundaries. Bennett studied Jack for a long moment, then nodded to his men. We'll continue this discussion another time, Maggie, when there are fewer distractions. He turned to leave, then paused. By the way, Jack, sorry about Frank. Terrible accident. These mountain roads can be treacherous, especially if a vehicle's maintenance isn't up to par. The statement hung in the air like a poison cloud. Jack's expression remained neutral, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Bennett smiled thinly and led his men out the door, the bell jingling cheerfully in their wake. As the door closed, Margaret let out a shaky breath. The few remaining customers murmured among themselves, some throwing curious glances toward Jack, others studiously avoiding looking his direction. Michael approached the counter, his young face a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Who are you? He asked Jack directly. Jack closed the wooden box carefully before answering. I served with your father in Korean, Special Forces. I hadn't seen him in a long time. Dad never mentioned a Jack Lawson to me, Michael said, his tone guarded. Margaret placed a hand on her son's shoulder. That's because Jack was listed as killed in action in 1973. Your father, he took it hard. She turned to Jack. Then 3 years later, the news reported you'd been found alive in a prison camp. Frank tried to contact you, but I wasn't ready. Jack finished simply. No excuses, no explanation that would suffice. The last customers were paying their bills, casting curious glances at the trio at the counter. Soon the diner was empty, except for Jack, Margaret, and Michael. Margaret flipped the sign on the door to closed and locked it, then drew the blinds. Why now? She asked, returning to stand across the counter from Jack. After all these years, Jack pushed the wooden box toward her. Frank sent me this 2 weeks ago. He extracted the letter and handed it to her, postmarked the day before he died. Margaret unfolded the paper with trembling fingers and read aloud. Jack, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. They're coming for me. I need you to protect Maggie and Michael. They're in danger because of what I've discovered about Bennett and the Interstate Project. There's more to tell, but not in writing. Find the files in my office. Trust no one in town administration or law enforcement. Bennett has them all in his pocket. You're the only one I trust with this. I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. Frank. Margaret looked up, her face pale. What does this mean? What had Frank discovered? Jack's eyes moved to Michael, then back to Margaret. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Margaret nodded slowly. There's an office in the back. It was Frank's space. She hesitated, then added, he kept it locked. I haven't been able to bring myself to go through his things. They moved to the back of the diner through the kitchen, where the grill had been shut down for the night. A narrow hallway led past a storeroom to a small office with a solid wooden door. Margaret produced a key from her pocket. He always kept it with him, she said softly. I found it with his personal effects after the accident. The office was small but meticulously organized. A metal desk dominated the space with filing cabinets along one wall and a corkboard covered in notes and maps on another. A worn leather chair sat behind the desk, and a small safe was visible in one corner. Did the police investigate his death? Jack asked, scanning the room. Margaret's expression hardened. Sheriff Donovan took a report, said it was clearly an accident, brake failure on Sawmill Road. The drop there is over 100 feet. Her voice cracked slightly. They found the truck at the bottom of the ravine. He died instantly, they said. And you didn't believe it was an accident, Jack stated, recognizing the doubt in her voice. Frank was meticulous about maintaining his vehicles. Michael interjected. He taught me everything about car maintenance, and since I was 12, that truck was in perfect condition. Margaret moved to the desk, running her fingers over its surface. He became secretive in the weeks before his death, making phone calls when he thought I couldn't hear, coming to the office late at night. She looked up at Jack. The night he died, he told me that if anything happened to him, I should expect you. That seems impossible now, but that's what he said. Jack nodded slowly, processing this information. Frank was many things, but he wasn't paranoid. If he thought he was in danger, he had reason. He approached the corkboard, studying the materials pinned there. Most were related to diner operations, invoices, schedules, supply orders. But in one corner, partially hidden behind a calendar, was a map of Riverdale County with markings in red pen. Jack carefully moved the calendar aside to reveal the full map. The Interstate Commerce Project, he murmured, recognizing the proposed highway route highlighted in red. Several properties along the route were circled, including the diner's location. But there was another marking, an X drawn at a remote location several miles from the highway path on what appeared to be Bennett property. Michael had moved to stand beside him. Dad was obsessed with that project, said it would destroy the town, not save it. Bennett's been buying up properties all along the proposed route, Margaret added, offering fair prices at first, then when people refuse, things happen. Business downturns, bank loans, called in zoning problems. Jack turned to the safe in the corner. Does either of you know the combination? Margaret shook her head. Frank never shared it with me, said it was better I didn't know. Jack knelt before the safe, studying it. A standard Century model from the mid-70s. He'd opened similar ones before during his Special Forces training. He pressed his ear against the metal door, fingers gently turning the dial, listening for the subtle clicks of the mechanism. Years of practice had given him exceptional tactile sensitivity. After several minutes of careful manipulation, he felt the final tumbler fall into place. The handle turned and the safe door swung open. Inside were several folders, a small lockbox, and a revolver. A .38 Special that Jack recognized as standard military officer issue from their Korean days. He removed the folders and placed them on the desk, then checked the revolver. Loaded, clean, ready for use. Frank had been preparing for trouble. The first folder contained property records for the diner insurance documents in the deed to the Miller family home. The second held newspaper clippings about the Interstate Commerce Project dating back 3 years. Jack spread these across the desk, scanning headlines. Major development plan for Riverdale. County approves highway connector. Bennett Corp promises economic revival. The third folder was labeled simply Maxwell. Inside were photocopies of financial records, bank transfers, and what appeared to be internal memos from Bennett's corporation. Jack examined these closely, his expression darkening as he read. Frank was investigating Bennett, he said finally. These documents suggest the interstate project isn't just about economic development. There are financial irregularities, payments to county officials, falsified environmental impact statements. Margaret looked over his shoulder at the documents. Is this why they killed him, because he discovered corruption? Possibly, Jack conceded, but his instincts told him there was more. He opened the small lockbox, finding inside a single cassette tape labeled Eddie, June 15th, and a folded piece of paper. The paper contained a series of numbers and what looked like geographic coordinates. Who's Eddie? Jack asked, looking up at Margaret. A shadow crossed her face. Eddie Thompson. He served with you and Frank, didn't he? Frank told me he died in Korean. Jack's expression remained carefully neutral, but his mind was racing. Eddie Thompson, the third member of their Special Forces team, had supposedly died during the mission that led to Jack's capture in '69. At least that was the official story. That's right, he said carefully. At least that's what I was told. Michael, who had been examining the map, pointed to the X marked on the Bennett property. Do you think this has something to do with it? Dad drove out that way several times in the weeks before he died. Jack pocketed the cassette tape and the note with coordinates. I intend to find out. He turned to Margaret. Frank asked me to protect you both. That means I need to understand what he was involved in, and why Bennett seems so interested in this diner specifically. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight of the situation evident on her face. We're 3 months behind on the bank loan. Bennett's the majority shareholder in Riverdale First National. If we can't make the payments, the bank takes the diner and Bennett gets what he wants anyway. How much do you need to catch up? Jack asked. $20,000, Margaret replied, her voice hollow. Frank had a life insurance policy that would cover it, but the company is stalling on the payout, demanding more documentation about the accident. Another Bennett connection, Jack murmured, making the connection. Who's handling the insurance claim? Midwestern Life and Casualty, Michael answered. Their regional office is in Columbus. Jack nodded, filing this information away. Tomorrow I'll see what else I can learn about Frank's accident in this interstate project. For tonight, he paused, then continued with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. Is there somewhere nearby I could stay? Margaret seemed surprised by the question. There's a motel on the edge of town, but she hesitated, then continued more firmly. Frank would want you to stay here. We have a spare room upstairs. Jack shook his head. I don't want to impose, and it might be safer if Bennett doesn't know I'm connected to you. Michael, who had been quiet for some time, spoke up. There's the apartment above the garage. Dad used it as a workshop, but it has a bed and bathroom. It's separate from the house with its own entrance. Jack considered this, then nodded. That would work. Thank you. As they prepared to leave the diner, Jack gathered the documents and replaced them in the safe. He kept only the tape, the coordinates, in one file containing the most damning evidence against Bennett. The revolver he holstered in a concealed carry position under his jacket, a habit from years of living on constant alert. The rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle when they stepped outside. Jack retrieved his motorcycle while Margaret and Michael got into their car, an aging Ford station wagon that had seen better days. As he followed them through the quiet streets of Riverdale, Jack's mind was processing everything he'd learned. Frank Miller had discovered something that got him killed. Bennett wanted the diner property badly enough to resort to threats and possibly murder. And somehow it all connected to their shared past, to Korean, to Eddie Thompson, to the mission that had changed all their lives. Jack knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wouldn't fail Frank again. Whatever his old friend had discovered, whatever danger threatened his family, Jack would see it through. He owed Frank that much. He owed it to himself. The Miller's home was a modest two-story farmhouse on the outskirts of town with a detached two-car garage. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Jack noticed how Margaret instinctively scanned the surroundings, a habit she'd likely developed since Frank's death. They were being careful. Good. The apartment above the garage was simple but clean. A single room with a bed, small kitchenette, and a bathroom just large enough for a shower stall. Tools lined the walls and a workbench stood under the window. Frank's domain. The space smelled of motor oil, metal, and the faint scent of the same aftershave Frank had used in Korean. It was like stepping into a time capsule. It's not much, Margaret apologized, switching on the lights, but it's private. It's perfect, Jack assured her. And it was, defensible with clear sight lines to the approach road and multiple exit options. Old habits. Michael brought in fresh linens for the bed, while Margaret found clean towels. Their efficiency spoke of people accustomed to managing on their own, making do with limited resources. Jack set his duffel bag on the workbench and hung his jacket on a wall hook. We'll talk more in the morning, Margaret said as they prepared to leave. She paused at the door. Jack, thank you for coming. I don't know what Frank was involved in, but he trusted you. That's enough for me. After they left, Jack secured the space, checking locks, positioning furniture to create an early warning system if anyone tried to enter while he slept. He placed Frank's revolver under his pillow and the wooden box containing his own Purple Heart on the nightstand. Only then did he allow himself to truly feel the weight of the day. Frank was dead, murdered most likely, and Jack had arrived too late to save him, just as he'd been too late for so many others in his life. His wife who'd remarried believing him dead, his parents who'd passed away while he was in the prison camp, the men in his unit who'd died while he survived. He moved to the window, looking out at the quiet countryside. Somewhere out there, Bennett was planning his next move. Jack had no illusions about what he was up against. Bennett had money, influence, connections. Jack had combat skills that were decades old, instincts honed by years of survival, and a promise to keep. He removed the cassette tape from his pocket, studying it in the dim light. Eddie Thompson, the third member of their team, the man who had supposedly died in the ambush that led to Jack's capture. What connection did he have to all this after all these years? Jack didn't have a tape player, but he was certain he'd find one in the diner. Tomorrow would bring answers, and possibly more danger. But for now, he needed rest. He lay on the bed fully clothed except for his boots, the revolver within easy reach. Sleep didn't come easily to Jack Lawson. It never had not since Korean. But tonight, in the workshop of his dead friends, surrounded by the tools and scents of a life well lived, he fell into a deeper sleep than he had known in years. And for once, the nightmare stayed at bay. Morning came with the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere nearby. Jack was instantly alert, his hand moving to the revolver before his conscious mind had fully registered the innocent source of the sound. He rose and moved to the window. The eastern sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the fields surrounding the Miller property bathed in early light. No sign of movement, no vehicles on the approach road. He performed his morning routine with military precision, washing, shaving, checking his few possessions. The leather jacket worn but still serviceable, the boots polished from habit, the wallet containing $752 in cash, a driver's license in his own name, and a VA identification card he rarely used. The wooden box with his Purple Heart. These were the sum total of Jack Lawson's worldly possessions. Everything else he needed was on his motorcycle or in his mind. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He moved silently to answer it, revolver held low against his leg. Through the window, he saw Michael standing on the landing, holding a thermos and a paper bag. Jack tucked the weapon into his waistband at the small of his back and opened the door. "Mom sent breakfast," Michael said, offering the items. "Coffee and egg sandwiches." "Thank you," Jack had replied, accepting them. He hesitated, then stepped back. "Would you like to come in?" Michael entered cautiously, his eyes taking in the space that had once been his father's domain. "Dad spent a lot of time up here, working on engines mostly, teaching me." His expression was a complex mix of grief and determination. He talked about Korean sometimes. Never in detail, but he mentioned a Jack and an Eddie. Said you were the best soldiers he ever knew. Jack has set the breakfast items on the workbench. "Your father was a good man, the best I knew." Michael's gaze hardened. "If Bennett killed him, I want to help you prove it." The vehemence in the young man's voice gave Jack pause. "This could be dangerous, Michael. Your father would want you safe." "My father would want justice," Michael countered. "And I'm not a kid. I know this town, the people in it. I can help." Jack studied him carefully. Frank's son had his father's determination, that much was clear. And he was right about knowing the town and its people, information Jack would need. "All right," Jack conceded, "but you follow my lead, and if things get too dangerous, you step back." "Deal." Michael nodded firmly. "Deal." He pulled a folded newspaper from his back pocket and handed it to Jack. "You might want to see this. Just came out this morning." The Riverdale Gazette's headline read, "Interstate Commerce Project Gains Federal Approval." Beneath was a photograph of Maxwell Bennett shaking hands with what appeared to be a state congressman. The article detailed how the project would bring walls in economic growth to the struggling rural county, with construction scheduled to begin in 3 months. "Bennett's been working on this for years," Michael explained. "Dad said it was suspicious how fast the approvals came through, how environmental concerns were dismissed." Jack skimmed the article. "Does Bennett own the newspaper too?" "Not officially, but the editor's son works for Bennett Industries." Jack nodded. Information, connections. These were the currencies of small-town power structures. Bennett had spent decades building his influence, while Jack had been wandering from place to place, running from his past. "I need to examine the site of your father's accident," Jack said, "and I need to listen to this tape." He showed Michael the cassette. "There's a player in the kitchen," Michael offered. "Mom's at the diner already. She opens at 6 every morning." "Let's start there then, after breakfast." Jack opened the paper bag, the smell of eggs and bacon reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten a home-cooked meal. As they ate, Jack asked Michael questions about the town, about Bennett's operations, about changes in recent years. The young man was observant and articulate, providing details that painted a picture of a community in transition with Bennett at the center of the changes. "Most people see him as Riverdale's savior," Michael explained. "The farms have been struggling for years, and the factories closed down in the 70s. Bennett promises jobs prosperity." And those who oppose him. Michael's expression darkened. They tend to have bad luck, like Harlan Jenkins, who refused to sell his farm. Suddenly, the bank called in his loan, or Sarah Thompson, whose insurance claim was denied after her husband died. Jack's attention sharpened. Thompson. Any relation to Eddie Thompson? His widow. She still lives out on River Road. Her husband was declared killed in action in Korean, but his body was never recovered. Dad used to check in on her now and then. Another piece of the puzzle. Jack filed the information away for later. After breakfast, they headed to the main house. It was a modest farmhouse, well-maintained, but showing signs of financial strain. Repairs, put-off paint fading in places. Inside, the decor was simple and homey. Family photographs lined the walls of the living room. Michael's graduation, Margaret and Frank on their wedding day, Frank in his military uniform. Jack paused at one particular photo. Frank, Eddie, and himself standing before a helicopter, in Korean, young and confident, unaware of what lay ahead. The same image he'd seen in the diner. Dad kept that on his bedside table, Michael said quietly. Said it reminded him of who he was fighting for. The kitchen was warm and inviting with checked curtains and well-used appliances. Michael located a cassette player on the counter and inserted the tape Jack had found in Frank's safe. The recording began with static, then Frank's voice emerged, older than Jack remembered, but unmistakable. June 15, 1984, meeting with Eddie Thompson at Riverside Motel Room 12. Jack and Michael exchanged glances of surprise. Eddie Thompson, supposedly dead for 15 years, had met with Frank just weeks before Frank's death. The tape continued capturing a conversation between two men. Frank's voice was clear, the other more hesitant, rougher. It's all connected, Frank, Eddie's voice said. Bennett, the project, what happened in Nam. He's been planning this for years. You're sure about the shipments? Frank asked. Positive. 3 so far coming through the old mining property. That's why he needs the highway. Legitimate cover for transport. Same playbook as Nam. We need proof, Eddie. Something solid to take to the feds. Bennett owns everyone local. Working on it, but we need to be careful. These people killed before they'll do it again. The conversation continued, discussing surveillance plans, potential evidence. Then Eddie's voice turned urgent. If anything happens to me, there's a fail-safe. Remember that bunker we found? I've left everything there. Coordinates are a series of numbers followed matching those on the paper Jack had found with the tape. And if something happens to both of us, Frank asked. A pause. Then it's down to Jack. If he's still the man we knew, he'll finish what we started. The tape ended with static. Jack and Michael sat in silence for a moment, processing what they'd heard. Dad never told us Eddie was alive, Michael said finally. And what shipments were they talking about? Jack's mind was working through the implications. In Korean, we uncovered an operation smuggling heroin back to the States using military transport. Someone high up was involved. We were ambushed before we could report it. He looked at Michael gravely. The coordinates on this tape point to Bennett's old mining property. I think Eddie and Frank discovered Bennett is using the interstate project as cover for drug trafficking. That's why they killed Dad. Michael said, his voice hollow with realization. He knew too much. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted them. Through the window, Jack saw a police cruiser pulling into the driveway. He tensed instinctively. That's Sheriff Donovan, Michael said, his tone making clear his distrust of the man. The one who ruled Dad's death an accident. Jack moved away from the window, his mind quickly calculating options. Is there a back way out of the house? Through the mudroom, Michael replied. But you don't have to hide. They don't know who you are yet. Jack considered this. You're right. Better to establish a presence openly than be discovered later. He removed the cassette from the player and pocketed it. Follow my lead. Say as little as possible. They waited as heavy footsteps approached the front door, followed by a loud knock. Michael answered, revealing a heavy-set man in a sheriff's uniform, perhaps 50 years old, with a florid face and the bearing of someone who enjoyed his authority. Morning, Michael, the sheriff said, his eyes moving past the young man to fix on Jack. Who's your visitor? Jack Lawson, Jack answered before Michael could speak. Old friend of the family, just passing through. Sheriff Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly. Lawson, don't recall Frank mentioning any Lawsons. We served together, lost touch after Korean. Jack's tone was neutral, giving away nothing. That's so funny time to show up right after he passes. And the sheriff stepped inside without being invited, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. Mrs. Miller, know you're here. She invited me, Jack replied evenly. I'm staying in the apartment above the garage. Donovan grunted, his eyes scanning the kitchen, noting the cassette player. Well, welcome to Riverdale, Mr. Lawson. Small town, everyone knows everyone's business. He turned to Michael. Just stopping by to remind your mother about the property tax assessment hearing next Tuesday. County reassessing values due to the new development. I'll tell her, Michael said stiffly. The sheriff lingered, clearly trying to gauge Jack's purpose. How long you planning to stay, Mr. Lawson? Jack met his gaze steadily. Depends on how long the family needs me. Something passed between the two men, an unspoken challenge. Donovan was the first to look away. Well, I'll let Mrs. Miller know you stopped by, Michael said, clearly trying to end the conversation. Donovan nodded slowly. You do that. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Lawson, Riverdale's a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way. After the sheriff departed, Jack moved to the window and watched until the cruiser disappeared down the road. He'll report to Bennett, Jack said matter-of-factly. We need to move quickly now. Michael looked concerned. What's our next step? Jack's expression was resolute. We find out what happened to Eddie Thompson, and we visit that mining property. The pieces were falling into place. Frank's letter, Eddie's resurrection, Bennett's project, the coordinates. Whatever Frank and Eddie had discovered had cost Frank his life. Now Jack was the only one left who could finish what they started. He'd arrived 11 years too late to save his friend, but he wasn't too late to protect Frank's family and bring his killers to justice. For the first time in decades, Jack Lawson had a mission worthy of the man he once was. Let's go, he said to Michael. Time to keep a promise. Jack's Harley rumbled along the rural highway, Michael following close behind in his father's old pickup truck. The morning sun cast long shadows across fields that had sustained generations of Riverdale families. Soon these same fields would be buried beneath concrete and commerce if Bennett's plans succeeded. They drove in silence towards Sawmill Road, where Frank Miller had met his end 3 months earlier. Jack's mind worked methodically, organizing facts, identifying gaps, formulating theories. The cassette recording had confirmed his suspicions. Eddie Thompson, their third teammate, had somehow survived Korean and connected with Frank recently. Together, they had uncovered something dangerous about Bennett's interstate commerce project, something worth killing for. Sawmill Road wound through dense forest before descending steeply toward Thompson Creek. The road narrowed as it climbed with a sharp curve at the summit, followed by the steep descent. No guardrails protected vehicles from the 100-foot drop to the rocky ravine below. Jack slowed his motorcycle, scanning the terrain with a soldier's eye. A perfect location for an ambush, or to disguise a murder as an accident. He pulled over at the curve, Michael parking behind him. This is where it happened, Michael said, joining Jack at the edge of the road. His voice was tight with controlled emotion. They found Dad's truck down there. Said he took the curve too fast, brake lines failed. Jack knelt, examining the pavement. 3 months had passed, but faint traces remained: skid marks, broken glass ground into the asphalt, the scrape of metal against the lone boulder that served as a primitive barrier. Show me exactly where they recovered the vehicle, Jack said. Michael pointed to a spot far below where the ravine widened slightly before continuing toward the creek. Down there, it took them hours to reach him. The truck was destroyed. Jack studied the angle of descent, the pattern of the skid marks, the damage to the shoulder of the road. Your father was an experienced driver, especially on these roads. He'd driven this route his entire life, Michael confirmed. In all weather conditions, he was careful, methodical. Jack nodded, pieces falling into place. The official report claimed brake failure, but the skid marks tell a different story. He pointed to the black streaks on the pavement. These indicate your father did brake hard before going over. The brakes were working, at least initially. Michael's eyes widened. Then what happened? I believe someone forced him off the road, Jack said, moving to examine the outer edge. Look here. He indicated a series of scrapes and paint transfers on the rocky outcrop. Your father's truck was dark blue, correct? Yes. This paint is black. Consistent with a larger vehicle, possibly an SUV or truck, striking your father's vehicle from behind or the side. Michael's face paled, then hardened with anger. Bennett's man Ray drives a black Suburban. Jack stood brushing dirt from his hands. I need to see the accident report and any photographs. Did the police share those with your mother? No, Sheriff Donovan said the case was straightforward, mechanical failure, no foul play. Convenient, Jack muttered. We need those records. They returned to their vehicles, Jack's mind already formulating a plan to access the police files. As they prepared to leave, a dark sedan appeared approaching slowly from the direction of town. Jack motioned for Michael to stay behind him. The car stopped and Sarah Thompson emerged from the driver's side. In her mid-50s, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the lines of hardship etched on her face. Jack recognized her immediately, Eddie's wife, though time had silvered her once brown hair and deepened the resolve in her eyes. Michael Miller, she called, approaching cautiously. I thought that was you. Her eyes shifted to Jack, narrowing slightly. And you must be Jack Lawson. Frank mentioned you might return someday. Jack stepped forward, extending his hand. Mrs. Thompson, it's been a long time. She accepted his handshake, her grip firm and brief. Not since 1969, the military told me you died alongside Eddie in Korean. Her tone held no accusation, merely statement of fact. They told me the same about Eddie, Jack replied. Yet I have reason to believe he was alive as recently as 3 months ago. Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes, confirmation, Jack thought. She glanced around, surveying the empty road. This isn't the place to talk, she said quietly. Bennett has people everywhere. Follow me back to my house. We'll be safer there. They followed Sarah's sedan through winding back roads, taking an indirect route that suggested familiarity with evasion techniques. Jack noted with approval that she checked her mirrors frequently, made unexpected turns, and once pulled over briefly to ensure they weren't being followed. The Thompson property sat nestled against the foothills, a modest farmhouse surrounded by fields that had once grown corn but now lay fallow. A weathered barn stood to one side and an American flag hung limply from a pole near the front porch. It was the home of a woman who had learned to manage alone. They parked behind the house out of sight from the road. Sarah led them inside without speaking, her movements efficient and purposeful. The interior was neat but sparse with furniture that had seen decades of use. Photos of Eddie in uniform occupied prominent places, a shrine to a man long presumed dead. In the kitchen, Sarah put on a pot of coffee before turning to face them. How much do you know? She asked directly. Frank sent me a letter asking for help protecting his family, Jack replied. I found a recording of him meeting with someone identified as Eddie Thompson 3 months ago, discussing Bennett's development project and some kind of shipments. Sarah nodded slowly, a decision visibly forming in her mind. She moved to a bookshelf in the adjoining room and removed a false panel, extracting a thick envelope. Eddie didn't die in Korean, she confirmed, returning to the kitchen table. He was captured alongside you, Jack, but sent to a different camp. After the war ended, he learned things that made him dangerous to certain people. He came home in 1975, but he couldn't come home to me, not officially. She opened the envelope, spreading photographs across the table. He's lived under different names, moving frequently. We maintained contact through coded messages and classified ads, occasional secret meetings. For 20 years, he's been gathering evidence. The photographs showed various locations around Riverdale County, Bennett's mining property, remote airstrips, meetings between Bennett and men with military or government bearings. Dates stamped in the corners indicated a long-term surveillance operation spanning years. Eddie discovered that Bennett was part of a network that began during Korean officials, contractors, and local authorities who used military transports to smuggle heroin back to the States. After the war, they evolved. Now they use private companies, development projects, and political connections to move drugs, launder money, and maintain power. Jack studied the photos intently. Your husband's been investigating this for 2 decades. Sarah nodded. It became his mission. When Bennett announced the interstate project 3 years ago, Eddie recognized the pattern major infrastructure development as cover for expanded trafficking operations. He reached out to Frank, knowing his position in the community might help gather evidence. And now both Frank and Eddie are dead, Jack said grimly. Sarah's face tightened with pain. Eddie disappeared 6 weeks ago. His last message said he'd found proof at Bennett's mining property, something that would expose the entire operation. He planned to meet with federal authorities. She met Jack's gaze directly. He never made it. Michael, who had been examining the photographs, looked up sharply. These coordinates on Dad's note, they match a location on Bennett's property, Sarah confirmed with a phone. An abandoned vertical shaft from the old silver mining days. Eddie believed Bennett was using it to store shipments before distribution. Jack considered this information, weighing options and risks. Bennett knows I'm in town now. Sheriff Donovan will have reported my presence. If we're going to find whatever Eddie discovered, we need to move quickly before they sewer or destroy it. It's not that simple, Sarah cautioned. The property is guarded with security patrols and cameras. Eddie spent months studying their routines, finding blind spots. Do you have his notes? Jack asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. In the barn, along with something else you'll need. The barn's interior was dim and dusty, smelling of hay and old motor oil. Sarah led them to the back, where she unlocked a trap door concealed under farm equipment. Below was a small room, a bunker of sorts, containing a desk, filing cabinets, and communication equipment. Eddie's command center, she explained, switching on a bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. He operated like he was still behind enemy lines. In many ways, he was. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and diagrams. Bennett's properties, the proposed highway route, personnel charts showing connections between local officials, state authorities, and Bennett's corporation. It was the work of a man obsessed, meticulous, and deeply committed to exposing the truth. Sarah unlocked a cabinet and removed a file labeled Mine Operation. Inside were detailed notes on security patrol schedules, guard rotations, blind spots in the camera coverage, and the safest approach roads. Eddie identified a maintenance access tunnel that isn't on any official maps, she explained, pointing to a hand-drawn diagram. It connects to the main shaft about 50 feet below ground. The entrance is concealed in a drainage culvert half a mile from the main property. Jack studied the notes carefully. Eddie's military training was evident in the precision of his observations, the thoroughness of his reconnaissance. When was this information last updated? 2 months ago. After Frank died, Eddie became more cautious, more isolated. He suspected his cover was compromised. Jack turned to Michael. This will be dangerous. I should go alone. Michael's jaw set stubbornly. My father died for this. I'm coming with you. Before Jack could argue, Sarah intervened. Neither of you is going unprepared. She moved to another cabinet and unlocked it, revealing a small arsenal, 2 pistols, a hunting rifle, night vision equipment, and tactical gear. Eddie kept these for contingencies, she said, removing a Colt M1911, the standard issue sidearm they'd carried in Korean. He'd want you to have this, Jack. It's the one he carried back then. He kept it clean, maintained. Jack accepted the weapon, checking it with practiced hands. The familiar weight brought back memories, some he had spent decades trying to forget, others that reminded him of who he'd once been. A soldier, a man of purpose and principle. We'll go tonight, he decided, looking at the patrol schedules. The security rotation changes at 2 a.m., creating a 15-minute window with minimal coverage on the north perimeter. Michael examined the night vision equipment. I've never used anything like this. I'll show you, Jack assured him, but you'll stay as backup. Your job will be to watch the approach road and warn me of any security movement. He turned to Sarah. Do you have communications equipment? She produced 2-way radios with earpieces. Short-range secure frequency. Eddie modified them himself. They spent the next hour reviewing the plans, studying the approach, and preparing equipment. Jack was impressed by Michael's quick comprehension and determination. Frank's son had inherited his father's intelligence and resolve. As they prepared to leave, Sarah touched Jack's arm, holding him back, while Michael loaded equipment into the truck. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Eddie believes someone in your old unit was working with Bennett back in Korean, someone who betrayed your team and helped establish the smuggling operation. Jack's expression hardened. Did he identify this person? He had suspicions, but no proof. That's partly what he was looking for at the mine records from the early days, proof of the original conspiracy. Jack nodded, absorbing this new dimension. Thank you, Sarah, for keeping Eddie's mission alive, for helping us now. Her eyes held his, searching. Eddie never blamed you, Jack, for surviving when he was presumed dead, for not knowing he'd made it back. He understood the fog of war, the chaos that separated you. Something tight in Jack's chest loosened slightly at her words. One small piece of the burden he'd carried for decades, the survivor's guilt, the questions about what had happened to his brothers in arms, eased. I'll find the truth, he promised, for Eddie, for Frank, for all of us who came home carrying Korean inside us. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Be careful. Bennett doesn't just have money and influence. He has people willing to kill to protect his operation. Jack's reply was simple. So do we. Back at the Miller farm, Jack and Michael transferred their equipment to the garage apartment away from prying eyes. They had several hours before nightfall to finalize preparations and rest before the operation. Margaret returned from the diner mid-afternoon, her face tight with worry, as Michael explained their discoveries and plans. Jack expected resistance, arguments about danger and risk. Instead, she listened silently before disappearing upstairs, returning minutes later with a small box. Frank kept this hidden in our bedroom, she said, placing it on the table. I found it after he died but couldn't make sense of it. Inside the box were photographs, ledger pages, and a small notebook filled with Frank's neat handwriting. The photos showed various locations around Bennett's properties with timestamps indicating they'd been taken over several months. Frank was conducting his own surveillance, Jack realized examining the materials. Parallel to Eddie's operation but focused on the financial aspects. The ledger pages contained account numbers, dates, and transaction amounts, evidence of money movement between shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses in Riverdale. Frank had meticulously documented a complex money laundering operation tied to Bennett's development projects. This is what got Frank killed, Jack said grimly. Concrete evidence of financial crimes. Margaret nodded, her composure remarkable under the circumstances. What can I do to help? Tonight's operation is reconnaissance only, Jack explained. We need to locate and secure whatever Eddie hid at the mine. But tomorrow we'll need to access Frank's safety deposit box at the bank. Bennett controls the bank, Margarita reminded him. Which is why we'll need a distraction, Jack replied. Something to keep attention focused elsewhere while you access the box. They spent the remaining daylight hours planning, preparing, and resting in shifts. Jack insisted Michael get several hours of sleep before the night operation, while he cleaned and checked their equipment with military precision. As dusk fell, an unexpected visitor arrived, Bill Harmon, the former sheriff who had been forced into early retirement when Bennett's candidate took office. In his late 60s, Harmon carried himself with the straight-back posture of a man accustomed to authority, though his civilian clothes hung loosely on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. Margaret greeted him cautiously at the door. Bill, what brings you out here? Information, he replied, his voice low. May I come in? Inside, Harmon glanced at Jack with immediate recognition. Special Forces, right? I can tell by how you carry yourself. Jack nodded once. Fifth Group. My brother was 1st Air Cav. Came home in '68. Harmon's expression suggested his brother's homecoming had not been a happy one. I heard you were asking questions about Frank's accident. Word travels fast, Jack observed. Small town, Harmon replied with a shrug, especially when Donovan makes a point of telling Bennett about new faces in town. Jack evaluated the former sheriff, weighing trust against caution. What information do you have? Harmon removed an envelope from inside his jacket. Copies of the original accident report, including photographs I took at the scene. Donovan altered the official record, but I kept my own documentation. Jack examined the photographs, clear images of skid marks, impact points, and Frank's destroyed truck at the bottom of the ravine. Most significantly, several shots showed distinct paint transfers on the rear bumper and driver's side of Frank's vehicle. He was forced off the road, Jack confirmed, finding visual evidence for his earlier hypothesis. Hit from behind first, then sideswiped when he didn't go over immediately. Harmon agreed. I tried to investigate, but 3 days later, the county commissioners voted to replace me with Donovan. My accident reconstruction expert was fired the same week. Why are you sharing this now? Jack asked directly. Harmon's weathered face hardened with resolve. Because Frank Miller was my friend for 40 years. Because I've watched Bennett corrupt this town piece by piece. And because I'm dying of pancreatic cancer and have nothing left to lose. The blunt admission hung in the air for a moment before Harmon continued. I have maybe 3 months. I'd like to see Bennett brought down before I go. Jack respected the man's directness. We're working on it. Tonight we're checking a location where evidence might be hidden. Harmon nodded thoughtfully. The old silver mine, Eddie's hiding place. Jack's surprise must have shown because Harmon smiled slightly. Eddie contacted me 6 weeks ago, just before he disappeared. Asked about old mining records access points. Did you help him? I gave him what I had, the original surveys from county archives maintenance records from when the mine was operational. Do you know what happened to Eddie? Michael asked. Harmon's expression darkened. Nothing definitive, but the night he disappeared, Ray Connor and Vince Mathis Bennett's enforcers were seen cleaning blood from the inside of Ray's Suburban. Margaret gasped softly while Michael's hands clenched into fists. Jack absorbed the information with outward calm, though inwardly his determination hardened. We could use your knowledge tonight, he told Harmon, your familiarity with the area, the personnel involved. Harmon nodded without hesitation. I'll create a diversion to draw security attention to the main gate, give you more time at the mine shaft. As darkness fell, they finalized their plans. Jack, Michael, and Harmon would approach from different directions using radios to coordinate their movements. Jack would enter the maintenance tunnel, while Michael monitored the perimeter, and Harmon created a distraction at the main entrance. They dressed in dark clothing, Jack and Michael wearing tactical vests provided from Eddie's supplies. Jack carried the Colt 45, while Michael was armed with a smaller 9mm pistol after receiving basic handling instructions. Harmon had his own revolver, a service weapon from his sheriff days. Remember, Jack instructed as they prepared to depart, this is reconnaissance only. We locate the evidence, assess security, and withdraw. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. As they moved toward their vehicles, Margaret stopped them at the door. The stoic woman who had endured her husband's death harassment from Bennett and threats to her livelihood now showed the steel beneath her surface. My husband died for this, she said, her voice steady. So did Eddie Thompson. Be careful, but do what needs doing. She handed Jack a small object, a silver St. Christopher medal. Frank always carried this, for protection. Jack accepted it solemnly, tucking it into his pocket. They departed separately. Harmon in his old Chevy Blazer, Jack on his motorcycle, Michael in Frank's truck, taking different routes toward Bennett's mining property. The night was clear, a half moon providing just enough light to navigate the rural roads without headlights. Jack led the way, his motorcycle's engine muffled to reduce noise. They established radio contact using brief coded communications to confirm positions. Bennett's mining property encompassed nearly 1,000 acres of woodland and former pasture in the northern part of the county. The main entrance featured a modern security gate with cameras and guard station, but the perimeter was too extensive to secure completely. Jack had identified their entry point from Eddie's notes, a service road that had once connected to a lumber operation now overgrown and unmarked on current maps. They left their vehicles concealed in a dense stand of trees half a mile from their target, continuing on foot. Jack moved with the silent efficiency of a man who had conducted countless night operations, his senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement in the darkness. Using night vision equipment, they navigated through the forest following the route Eddie had mapped. Michael proved surprisingly adept, maintaining pace in silence despite his inexperience. Training with Frank had clearly prepared him better than Jack had expected. Approaching checkpoint Alpha, Jack murmured into his radio. Status, perimeter clear, Michael confirmed from his position. Diversion ready on your mark, Harmon added from the main entrance area. They reached the drainage culvert that concealed the maintenance tunnel entrance. Decades of neglect had nearly hidden it from view, with vegetation and erosion camouflaging what had once been an engineering feature. Jack located the access point exactly where Eddie's diagram indicated, a rusted metal door built into the culvert's concrete wall, secured with a padlock that showed recent use. Found it, Jack reported. Lock appears active. Security patrol passing eastern perimeter, Michael warned. 2 minutes from your position. Jack examined the lock. It was new, not original to the tunnel, suggesting someone had been using this entrance recently. Eddie, most likely. Using tools from his pack, Jack made quick work of the lock, a skill acquired during Special Forces training and maintained through years of necessity. Initiating diversion in 30 seconds. Harmon's voice came through the earpiece. You'll have approximately 10 minutes before they realize it's a false alarm. The tunnel beyond the door was narrow and damp, smelling of mildew and stagnant water. Jack switched on a small, tactical flashlight, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize visibility from outside. Boot prints in the mud confirmed recent activity, someone Eddie's size based on the impression and stride length. Diversion active, Harmon reported. Security responding to main gate. Jack moved deeper into the tunnel, which sloped gradually downward. After approximately 200 yards, It intersected with a larger passage, part of the original mine infrastructure. The air was cooler here with a distinct mineral scent of underground spaces. Eddie's notes indicated the main shaft was accessible via a service ladder at the end of this passage. Jack located it without difficulty, a metal ladder descending into darkness, its rungs worn but solid. Before descending, he checked his radio. Entering vertical section. Communications may be limited. Understood, Michael replied. Perimeter still clear. Jack began his descent, the darkness swallowing him as he moved deeper underground. The ladder extended approximately 50 feet before reaching a landing part of the main shaft system that had once been the heart of the silver mining operation. Unlike the neglected access tunnel, this area showed signs of recent use and maintenance. Electric lights on a separate circuit illuminated the space, revealing modern equipment stored along the walls, generators, communications gear, and what appeared to be shipping containers. Jack moved cautiously, scanning for security measures. No cameras were visible, suggesting Bennett relied on the secrecy and inaccessibility of the location rather than active monitoring. The space was organized as a storage and transfer facility, with areas designated for incoming and outgoing shipments. At the far end of the chamber, a metal desk held logbooks and paperwork. Jack examined these, quickly photographing pages with a small camera he'd brought. The records confirmed Eddie and Frank's suspicions. Documentation of shipments moving through the facility, coded entries for contents, destinations, and financial transactions. But this wasn't what Eddie had risked his life to secure. According to Sarah, he'd found something more significant, proof of the original conspiracy evidence connecting Bennett to the Korean-era smuggling operation. Jack searched methodically, thinking like Eddie would. Where would a special forces operator hide critical intelligence in an enemy facility, somewhere accessible but not obvious? Somewhere that would survive if the facility was compromised? The answer came as he examined the chamber's construction. The original mining operation had ventilation shafts, narrow conduits that connected different levels of the mine. Most had been sealed or repurposed during modernization, but one section of wall showed signs of recent disturbance. Jack investigated the area, finding a loose panel that concealed a small cavity. Inside was a waterproof case containing a laptop computer, external hard drives, and a thick folder of documents. A note in Eddie's handwriting was taped to the case: insurance policy, JL if necessary. JL Jack Lawson. Eddie had prepared this for him, specifically anticipating that he might need to pass the mission to his former teammate. Jack secured the case in his backpack, then continued photographing the facility to document its current operations. His radio crackled with Michael's urgent voice. Security returning to normal patrol routes. 2 minutes to your position. Jack completed his documentation and began his withdrawal, climbing the ladder with the precious cargo secured to his back. At the top, he paused to ensure no sound came from the tunnel before proceeding. Moving to extraction point, he reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Problem. Michael responded immediately. Additional patrol vehicle approaching from the south, blocking our planned exit route. Jack processed this complication without breaking stride. Alternate route, Charlie. Meet at secondary rendezvous. He moved through the tunnel efficiently, his senses heightened by the knowledge that security patrols were converging on his location. Near the exit, he paused, listening intently for any sound from outside. Clear for exit, Michael confirmed after a tense silence. Jack emerged from the culvert into the night air, immediately moving to cover among the trees. The moon had passed behind clouds, providing additional concealment as he navigated toward their secondary meeting point, a clearing a quarter-mile east of their original approach. He reached the clearing to find Michael already waiting, tense but composed. Harmon's diversion worked, Michael reported. Security responded to a trespassing wildlife researcher at the main gate. He's clear and heading to the rendezvous. Good, let's move. Jack led the way back to their vehicles, maintaining vigilance despite their apparent success. Years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous phase of any operation was the extraction, when fatigue and false confidence could lead to mistakes. They reached their vehicles without incident and departed separately, reconvening at Sarah Thompson's farm as planned. Harmon arrived shortly after, a satisfied expression on his weathered face. Played the confused old former sheriff perfectly, he reported as they gathered in the barn's hidden room. Claimed I was following up on reports of trespassers. They were so busy explaining why I had no authority that they never checked the perimeter alarms. Jack placed Eddie's case on the desk, opening it carefully. The laptop was password protected, but a sealed envelope taped to its underside contained access credentials, Eddie's final precaution to ensure the information would be accessible. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation and dread. "Evidence," Jack replied, powering on the computer. "Exactly what Eddie promised. Documentation of current operations, shipping records, financial transactions." As the computer booted, Jack examined the paper documents from the case. These were older, some dating back to the early 1970s, and included military transport manifests, financial records, and correspondence between Bennett and various officials. Most significantly, there were photographs, surveillance images showing a younger Maxwell Bennett meeting with military officers in Korea inspecting cargo, exchanging documents. The final photo showed Bennett with three other men, one in military uniform, one in civilian government attire, and the third. "That's Captain Lawrence," Jack said, recognition dawning. Our commanding officer, Sarah, leaned closer, studying the image. "Eddie mentioned him, said he suspected someone in your chain of command was involved, but could never confirm it." "This confirms it," Jack said grimly. "Captain Lawrence authorized our reconnaissance mission into the area where we were ambushed. He knew exactly where we'd be when we'd be there." Michael examined the documents spread across the desk. "Is this enough to bring down Bennett?" "It's enough to start," Jack assessed. "The connection provides context and establishes the historical pattern, but the current operation is what will interest federal authorities." The laptop had finished booting, and Jack navigated through Eddie's meticulously organized files. They contained comprehensive documentation of Bennett's current drug trafficking operation, shipments disguised as construction materials for the interstate project distribution networks throughout the Midwest, financial trails showing how proceeds were laundered through legitimate businesses, including Riverdale Development Corporation. Most damning were video recordings Eddie had somehow obtained meetings between Bennett and his associates discussing operations, handling products, counting money. Bennett's voice was clearly identifiable, his face visible in multiple clips. "Eddie risked everything for this," Sarah said softly, watching the video evidence of her husband's final mission. Jack nodded solemnly. "And we'll make sure it wasn't in vain." They spent the next hour reviewing the evidence, identifying the most compelling documentation for presentation to authorities. Jack was careful to create duplicates of everything, recognizing that Bennett's influence might compromise initial attempts to bring him to justice. "We need someone we can trust," Harmon said. "Someone beyond Bennett's reach." "I have a contact at the FBI field office in Cincinnati," Jack revealed. "Someone from the old days, unconnected to local politics." "Can they be here by tomorrow?" Sarah asked. Jack checked his watch, nearly 3 a.m. "I'll make the call at first light, but before we involve federal authorities, we need one more piece of evidence." "The safety deposit box," Michael realized. "Dad's financial records." Jack nodded. "Those documents will connect the money laundering operation directly to Bennett's legitimate businesses. Complete the picture." They finalized their plan for the morning. Margaret would access the safety deposit box at Riverdale First National, while Jack created a diversion to draw attention away from her. Michael would remain with Sarah to continue organizing the evidence and prepare copies for federal authorities. As they prepared to leave, Jack took Sarah aside. "Eddie was a good man, one of the best I ever served with. He deserved to come home to you properly, to live the life that was taken from him." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, grief showing through her strong exterior. "He never stopped trying to make things right. Even when he couldn't come home, he never stopped fighting for what was right." "We'll finish his mission," Jack promised, "and we'll make sure the world knows what he sacrificed." Back at the Miller farm, Jack secured Eddie's evidence in the garage apartment while Michael briefed his mother on their discoveries and the plan for the morning. Dawn was approaching as Jack finally allowed himself a brief rest, though decades of vigilance kept him in a state of semi-alertness even in sleep. He awoke 2 hours later to the sound of vehicles approaching the farm, multiple engines moving with purpose. Instantly alert, he moved to the window in time to see 3 police cruisers and a black Suburban pull into the driveway. Sheriff Donovan emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Ray and Vince from the Suburban. Additional deputies took flanking positions as Donovan approached the house. Jack grabbed his radio. "Michael, law enforcement at the house. Appears hostile. Get your mother to safety if possible." "Too late," came Michael's tense reply. "They're already at the door." Jack assessed the situation rapidly. The evidence from the mine was secure in his possession, but Margaret and Michael were vulnerable. Direct confrontation would escalate the situation dangerously. He watched as Donovan pounded on the front door, his stance aggressive. When Margaret answered, the sheriff handed her an official document. Search warrant, Michael reported through the radio. They're claiming anonymous tip about stolen property from Bennett Mining. Jack understood immediately. They know we accessed the mine. Someone spotted us or detected the intrusion afterward. What do we do? Michael asked, his voice tense but controlled. Let them search, Jack instructed. There's nothing incriminating in the house. Maintain calm, answer minimally. Where's the evidence from Frank's box? Still at the bank. Mom was going this morning. Jack made a rapid decision. Tell your mother to proceed as planned. I'll handle things here. And Michael, whatever happens, say nothing about the mine or Eddie's evidence. He watched as deputies entered the house, beginning their search. Donovan remained on the porch speaking with Margaret, while Ray and Vince circled toward the garage toward Jack's position. The trap was closing. Bennett was moving to neutralize them before they could act. But Bennett didn't know what they'd already discovered, didn't realize how much evidence was already secured. Jack Lawson had survived a prison camp, decades of wandering, and a lifetime of regret. He wouldn't be stopped now, not when justice for Frank and Eddie was finally within reach. Ray and Vince approached the garage, their postures indicating they expected resistance. Jack made a quick decision, not retreat, not confrontation, but tactical repositioning. He secured the evidence in his motorcycle's hidden compartment, then moved silently to the rear exit of the apartment. The endgame had begun sooner than expected, but the objective remained clear: protect the Millers, secure the evidence, and bring Bennett to justice. After decades of running from his past, Jack Lawson was finally running toward something: redemption. Jack slipped through the rear window of the garage apartment moments before Ray and Vince burst through the door. From his concealed position behind the workshop, he watched as Bennett's men searched the small living space with methodical efficiency. They were professionals, not common thugs, but men with training. Former military or law enforcement, Jack assessed, noting their systematic approach and coordinated movements. Clear, Ray called after checking the bathroom. No sign of Lawson. Vince knelt beside the bed, examining the impression in the mattress. He was here recently. Bedding still warm. Ray activated his radio. Target not present at secondary location. Likely mobile. He paused, listening to instructions. Understood. We'll secure any materials and continue search. Jack remained motionless as they ransacked the apartment, finding nothing of significance. The evidence from the mine was safely hidden in a concealed compartment he'd installed in his Harley saddlebag years ago, a precaution born from decades of living on society's margins, carrying possessions that couldn't afford scrutiny. He employed a gray man strategy, techniques he'd perfected during Sears survival: evasion, resistance, escape training. Moving only when the searchers looked elsewhere, using natural cover, leaving no trace of his passage. The weight distribution in his steps ensured silent movement across the gravel driveway. He maintained a relaxed posture despite the urgency. Tense muscles create visible movement patterns that trained observers can detect even at a distance. 3 minutes later, he was clear of the immediate search area, invisible to his pursuers, while maintaining full observation of their movements. When the men finally departed, Jack circled through the dense trees surrounding the property, maintaining a vantage point that allowed him to observe the ongoing search. Sheriff Donovan was directing deputies through the main house while Margaret and Michael stood on the porch, their postures tense but dignified. Jack felt a surge of admiration for their composure under pressure. His radio crackled softly. Jack, this is Michael. They're searching everywhere but finding nothing. Mom told them you left early this morning after staying the night. Good, Jack replied quietly. Maintain that story. I'm nearby watching. They took Dad's files from his office. Expected. Anything critical? No, just diner business records. The important documents are still at the bank. Jack considered their options. Bennett was moving aggressively, which meant he felt threatened. Perhaps security at the mine had discovered the intrusion earlier than expected, or someone had informed on them. Either way, the timeline had accelerated. Change of plans, Jack decided. Too risky for your mother to access the safety deposit box now. They'll be watching her. What's our next move? Michael asked. I'll contact my FBI connection immediately rather than waiting. You and your mother should leave the farm. Once the search concludes, go to the diner as normal, maintain routine. I'll meet you there after I've arranged federal intervention. The search continued for nearly an hour before the sheriff and his deputies finally departed, leaving Ray and Vince parked across the street in their Suburban, waiting for Jack to return. Once the police were gone, Jack circled back to the garage from the densely wooded area behind the property. His motorcycle remained untouched, the evidence secure. He'd need to move quickly now, contact his FBI connection, and set things in motion before Bennett could eliminate the evidence they'd gathered. His phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. Jack answered cautiously. Lawson. Bill Harmon's voice came through, strained with urgency. Bennett's made his move. State police just arrested Sarah Thompson for trespassing and theft of corporate property. They're holding her at the county jail. Jack's jaw tightened. Bennett's tying up loose ends, eliminating witnesses. There's more, Harmon continued grimly. I've been monitoring police frequencies. Bennett's filed charges against you: assault, breaking, and entering theft. There's an APB out for your arrest. Expected, Jack replied calmly. They found evidence of our presence at the mine. You need to move fast. Bennett has connections in the state attorney's office. Once formal charges are filed, it becomes much harder to present your evidence credibly. Jack made a rapid decision. I'm calling my FBI contact now. Get to the Miller farm, help Michael and Margaret reach the diner safely. I'll meet you there when I can. He ended the call and immediately dialed another number, one he hadn't used in years, but had memorized as part of his Special Forces training. Never write down what can be compromised. Never forget what might save your life. After several rings, a gruff voice answered. Taylor? Frank Miller's dead, Jack said without preamble, and I've got evidence that Maxwell Bennett killed him. A pause. Jack Lawson, it's been a long time. Not long enough considering the circumstances. Robert Taylor had been with the Bureau for decades, working organized crime before heading the Cincinnati field office. They'd met during Jack's debrief after his rescue from captivity, forming a connection based on mutual respect and shared experiences. They'd maintained minimal contact over the years: Christmas cards with no return address, occasional messages through mutual connections, an insurance policy of sorts. Tell me, Taylor said simply. Jack outlined the situation concisely. Frank's murder disguised as an accident, Bennett's trafficking operation, and the evidence they'd recovered. Taylor listened without interruption. How solid is your evidence? He asked when Jack finished. Comprehensive. Financial records, shipping manifest, video recordings of Bennett directly involved in the operation, plus documentation connecting it to several state officials and possibly a federal judge. Taylor's sharp intake of breath was audible. A sitting federal judge. Which circuit? Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Lawrence. Jesus Christ, Jack. The corruption goes higher than I thought. All the more reason for immediate intervention, Jack replied grimly. Agreed. I'll assemble a team and be there in 3 hours. Can you secure the evidence until then? Yes, but Bennett's moving aggressively. He's already arrested one witness and filed charges against me. He'll be looking to eliminate anyone with knowledge of the operation. Stay mobile, Taylor advised. Avoid official channels. I'll come in quiet, no local coordination until we're ready to move. The Crossroads Diner on Route 16. We'll meet there at noon. Understood. And Jack, good to hear your voice after all these years. Let's finish what started back in the day. Jack ended the call and prepared to move. He'd need to reach the diner without being spotted by Bennett's men or local law enforcement. The back roads would be safer, though less direct. He mounted his motorcycle, ensuring the evidence was secure, and started the engine. As he pulled away from the Miller farm using a hunting trail that led through the woods rather than the main drive, Jack glanced back at the house where Frank had built a life after returning a normal life, a family, a purpose. The life Jack himself might have had if circumstances had been different. The morning sun filtered through the trees as he navigated the rural landscape, avoiding main roads and populated areas. His mind worked methodically, planning contingencies, assessing risks. Bennett wouldn't stop with legal maneuvering. Once he realized the extent of the evidence against him, he'd resort to more direct methods. The Millers were in danger, as was anyone connected to the investigation. Jack reached the outskirts of town and abandoned his motorcycle in an old equipment shed on abandoned farmland, another location from Sarah's notes. He continued on foot, using alleys and service passages to approach the diner unseen. The crossroads was busy with the morning breakfast crowd when Jack slipped in through the kitchen entrance. Michael spotted him immediately and ushered him into the office at the back. Margaret was there along with Bill Harmon. They looked up as Jack entered, relief evident on their faces. "We were worried," Margaret said simply. "Bennett's men are watching the diner," Michael reported. "Two plainclothes in a sedan across the street, plus Ray and Vince circling the block every 15 minutes. Jack nodded. "Expected. Bennett knows this is your base of operations." "What's our plan?" Harmon asked. "Sarah's being held without bail and they're looking for you. My FBI contact is on his way with a team. They'll be here at noon." Jack checked his watch. 3 hours. We need to secure ourselves and the evidence until then. Margaret straightened, determination hardening her features. "The diner stays open. Normal operations. If we change routine now, Bennett will know something's happening." "Agreed," Jack said. "Your safety is in visibility right now. Too many witnesses for Bennett to act openly." He removed the external hard drive containing copies of the evidence from his pocket. "This stays with you hidden, but accessible. If anything happens to me before Taylor arrives, give this to him directly." Margaret accepted the drive, securing it in a concealed pocket of her apron. "Where will you be?" "Close but not visible. Bennett's men are watching for me specifically." Michael leaned forward. "What about Mom's safety deposit box? Dad's financial records are still there." Jack considered this. "Bennett will be watching the bank too, but those records would strengthen our case significantly." Harmon cleared his throat. "I might have a solution. My niece works as a teller at Riverdale First National. She's never approved of Bennett's influence in town." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Can she access the vault?" "No, but she can create a distraction, perhaps help Margaret avoid notice." They formulated a plan. Harmon would contact his niece to arrange assistance while Margaret would visit the bank during the busy lunch hour, when the lobby would be crowded with customers. Jack would monitor from a concealed position nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. "Once we have the bank records, we'll reconvene here to meet Taylor's team," Jack concluded. "Until then, maintain normal operations and stay visible." As they prepared to return to their respective positions, Margaret paused, her hand on Jack's arm. "Frank believed in you. Even after all those years, he never lost faith that if he ever needed you, you'd come." Her eyes held his steadily. He was right. Jack felt something shift inside him, a small piece of the burden he'd carried for decades easing slightly. "I was too late for Frank. I won't be too late for justice." She held his gaze a moment longer. When Frank first came back, he was lost too. Took him years to find his way, but he did because he found people worth finding it for. The simple statement resonated with Jack in ways he couldn't fully articulate. For decades he'd existed rather than lived, drifting from place to place, taking temporary jobs, forming no lasting connections. Frank had found a different path. "Be careful," Margaret added softly. "We've already lost Frank. I don't want Michael to lose anyone else." Jack nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. He slipped out the back door and made his way to a vantage point in the vacant apartment above the hardware store across the street. From there, he could observe the diner, the street, and the approach to the bank 2 blocks away. The morning passed slowly, tension building as noon approached. Jack watched Bennett's men maintain their surveillance, noting their patterns and communications. They were well coordinated but predictable, a weakness he could exploit if necessary. At 11, Margaret left the diner for her banking errands, a routine task she performed every Friday. Jack tracked her progress toward Riverdale First National, noting that one of Bennett's watchers followed at a discreet distance. The bank was housed in a stately brick building that dated to the 1920s, its architecture reflecting a more prosperous era in Riverdale's history. Margaret entered and joined the line of customers waiting for teller service. Through binoculars, Jack observed the interior activity. Harmon's niece, a young woman at the center teller position, gave a nearly imperceptible nod as Margaret approached her window. After a brief transaction, she directed Margaret to the customer service desk, away from the main lobby and out of sight of the windows where Bennett's man was watching. 20 minutes later, Margaret emerged, her expression carefully neutral as she returned to the diner. The watcher followed, apparently satisfied that nothing unusual had occurred. Jack returned to the diner at 11:45, using the delivery entrance to avoid detection. In the office, Margaret was waiting, a slender envelope in her hands. "I got it," she said without preamble. Frank's documentation of every financial transaction between Bennett's companies and the bank over the past 3 years. Loan approvals that violated banking regulations, preferential interest rates, foreclosures on properties Bennett later acquired. Jack examined the documents quickly, noting their significance. This completes the picture. Evidence of both the illegal trafficking operation and the financial crimes that supported it. Michael entered, tension evident in his posture. Two men just came in, not Bennett's usual guys, suits government types. They're asking for you by name. Jack's instincts sharpened. Early federal response or Bennett's contacts in state government? How do we know? Margaret asked. We verify, Jack said, removing his phone. He stepped to the office window, observing the newcomers through the partially open blinds. Two men in dark suits, professional bearing, scanning the diner with practiced efficiency. Jack dialed Taylor's number. When he answered, Jack asked simply, "Did you send an advance team?" "Negative." Taylor responded immediately. "My team is still en route, ETA 30 minutes. No one else has been briefed." Understood. Jack ended the call and turned to the others. Not FBI, likely state police or attorney general's office. Bennett's connections moving against us before federal authorities arrive. What do we do? Michael asked. Jack made a rapid decision. Margaret, take the evidence and go out through the kitchen. Michael, create a distraction in the dining area. I'll handle our visitors. Jack, they could arrest you, Margaret protested. Better me than you with the evidence, he replied firmly. Get to the rendezvous point we discussed. Taylor will meet you there if I'm delayed. Margaret hesitated, then nodded, gathering the documents in the hard drive. She slipped out the back as Michael returned to the dining area. Jack watched through the blinds as Michael approached the men, gesturing emphatically about a problem in the kitchen. When they momentarily turned their attention to him, Jack emerged from the office, moving calmly but purposefully toward the front entrance. One of the men spotted him, eyes widening in recognition. Jack Lawson, State Police, stop right there. Jack paused, assessing options. The diner had nearly a dozen customers, witnesses to whatever happened next. Direct confrontation would endanger civilians and play into Bennett's narrative of Jack as a dangerous fugitive. Gentlemen, he said evenly, I believe we have a misunderstanding. The lead agent advanced, hand moving toward his concealed weapon. There's no misunderstanding. You're wanted for questioning regarding breaking and entering at Bennett mining property. Jack noticed Harmon entering the diner behind the agents, his expression signaling readiness to assist. Jack gave an imperceptible shake of his head, no direct intervention. I'd be happy to answer questions, Jack replied calmly. But I believe federal authorities would be interested in this matter as well. The agent's expression hardened. This is a state investigation. You'll come with us now. Actually, a new voice interjected from the doorway. This is now a federal investigation. Robert Taylor stood in the entrance, flanked by 4 agents and FBI windbreakers. In his 60s now, Taylor retained the commanding presence that had distinguished him throughout his career. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with penetrating eyes that missed nothing. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Taylor announced, displaying credentials. We're assuming jurisdiction in this matter, effective immediately. The state agents hesitated, clearly unprepared for federal intervention. The lead agent recovered quickly. We have valid warrants for Lawson's arrest on state charges, which are superseded by our federal investigation, Taylor replied smoothly. He approached, lowering his voice. I suggest you contact your superiors for guidance. Interference with a federal corruption investigation carries significant penalties, professional and personal. The implied threat was clear. After a tense moment, the state agents retreated, exiting the diner with final warning glances at Jack. Good to see you, old friend, Taylor said, extending his hand, though you seem to have a talent for complicated situations. Jack accepted the handshake. Some things never change. The diner had fallen silent, customers watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Taylor addressed them professionally. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the interruption. This is a federal matter that doesn't concern the general public. Please continue your meals. He gestured for Jack to follow him outside, where additional FBI vehicles were arriving. We need to move quickly. Bennett has connections in the state attorney general's office, but that won't stop him for long. Where's the evidence? Secure with Margaret Miller. She's heading to the rendezvous point now. Taylor nodded approvingly. My team has secured Sarah Thompson's release from county jail. She's being brought to our temporary command center. He studied Jack with professional assessment. You've done good work here, Jack, bringing this all together. Not just me, Jack corrected. Frank and Sarah did the hard part. I'm just finishing what they started. Taylor's expression sobered. And what Bennett and Lawrence tried to bury for decades. We're going to need your full statement on that aspect as well. They moved toward the FBI vehicles, but Jack paused, looking back at the diner where Michael and Harmon stood watching. The Millers need protection. Bennett won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses now that he knows federal authorities are involved. Already arranged, Taylor assured him. We have agents positioned at their farm and the diner. Bennett is under surveillance as we speak. As they prepared to depart, a commotion erupted down the street. A black Suburban was approaching at high speed, followed by two police cruisers with lights flashing. Bennett, Jack recognized immediately, making his move personally. Taylor issued rapid instructions to his team, who took defensive positions as the vehicles screeched to a halt nearby. Maxwell Bennett emerged from the Suburban, his usual polished appearance now showing signs of strain. Sheriff Donovan and several deputies flanked him, creating an unmistakable confrontation. "This is local jurisdiction," Donovan announced loudly. "We have outstanding warrants for Lawson's arrest." Taylor stepped forward, federal authority evident in his bearing. "This is now a federal corruption investigation, Sheriff. Your jurisdiction has been superseded." Bennett moved forward, his facade of civic respectability cracking under pressure. "This is outrageous. Lawson is a fugitive, a trespasser who broke into private property and stole corporate documents." "Mr. Bennett," Taylor replied evenly, "I suggest you contact your attorney immediately. Federal agents are currently executing search warrants at your mining facility, corporate offices, and private residence." Bennett's face paled visibly. "You have no right, no authority. We have evidence of interstate drug trafficking, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy spanning decades." Taylor continued implacably. "Your rights will be respected throughout our investigation, but I strongly advise cooperation at this point." A tense standoff ensued. The small-town Main Street transformed into the front line of a decades-old conflict, finally approaching resolution. Locals gathered at a distance, witnessing the unprecedented confrontation between the town's most powerful citizen and federal authorities. Bennett's veneer of civility crumbled completely as he advanced toward Jack, jabbing a finger against his chest. "You should have died in that prison camp, Lawson. You and Frank, both, all of you, should have rotted there." The admission hung in the air, shocking even his own men. Bennett realized his error too late, his face paling as he understood what he'd revealed. The implicit confession of murder wasn't something even his political connections could shield him from. "Mr. Bennett," Taylor said coldly, "you've just added to the charges we'll be filing." Bennett's composure cracked entirely. "This is all based on lies, fabrications by a washed-up veteran with a grudge." He pointed accusingly at Jack. "Lawson has been unstable since his return. Everyone knows it." Jack remained silent, allowing Bennett's increasingly desperate accusations to reveal his panic. Taylor maintained professional detachment, instructing his agents to establish a perimeter as the confrontation escalated. Sheriff Donovan, sensing the shifting balance of power, began to distance himself from Bennett. "Mr. Bennett, perhaps we should consult with the county attorney before proceeding further." Bennett turned on him furiously. "You work for me. You all work for me. I built this town when it was nothing but failing farms and empty storefronts." His unguarded admission hung in the air, damning in its implications of corruption and control. Onlookers murmured, many recording the scene on cameras and early mobile phones. Taylor nodded to his agents. "Mr. Bennett, you are under investigation for multiple federal crimes. I advise you to exercise your right to remain silent until your attorney is present." As federal agents moved to secure Bennett, Ray and Vince emerged from the Suburban, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Jack reacted instantly, his combat instincts engaging before conscious thought. He intercepted Vince with a precise strike to the solar plexus, disarming him in a fluid motion that belied his age. Taylor's agents subdued Ray simultaneously, preventing potentially deadly escalation. The confrontation ended as quickly as it had begun. Bennett, his security personnel, and Sheriff Donovan were taken into custody for questioning. Federal agents established control of the scene with professional efficiency, securing vehicles and collecting preliminary evidence. Jack stood amid the activity, experiencing the strange disconnection that often followed combat situations, the sudden transition from imminent danger to relative safety. Taylor approached respect evident in his expression. Old habits, Jack said simply. Some habits are worth keeping, Taylor replied. We need to move to the command center now. Margaret Miller is waiting with the evidence. They drove to the temporary FBI headquarters established at the county municipal building, neutral territory, outside Bennett's direct influence. Inside, the operation was fully underway. Agents coordinated multiple search teams, processed initial evidence, and prepared for interrogations. Margaret Michael and Sarah Thompson were waiting in a conference room along with Bill Harmon. The evidence they'd gathered was spread across the table: the computer files, Frank's financial records, the documentation of Bennett's illegal activities. Federal technicians were already processing the materials, creating secure copies, and establishing chain of custody. Bennett's in custody, Jack announced as they entered. It's happening, all of it. Sarah's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face. I knew this day would come. Frank never lost faith that the truth would eventually emerge. Because of his persistence, Jack acknowledged. And your courage. He never stopped fighting even when the rest of us had moved on. Taylor joined them, bringing updates from the various search operations. The mine facility is exactly as you described. We've seized significant quantities of narcotics cache and documentation. Bennett's corporate headquarters yielded additional financial records consistent with money laundering operations. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Miller, the financial documentation you provided is particularly valuable. It establishes clear patterns of banking violations and connects Bennett's legitimate businesses to his criminal enterprises. Margaret nodded solemnly. Frank always believed in keeping records. Paper trails don't lie, he used to say. What about Lawrence? Jack asked. The judge. Taylor's expression tightened. We've dispatched agents to secure him for questioning. The evidence connecting him to Bennett is compelling. It's not about personal vendettas, Jack clarified. It's about establishing the origin of the conspiracy that continued to the present day. About honoring the truth of what happened to Frank. Taylor nodded, understanding. Your formal statement will be crucial for that aspect. When you're ready. For the next several hours, Jack provided detailed testimony, the history with Bennett, the suspicious circumstances of Frank's death, the discovery of the trafficking operation, and Lawrence's involvement in the conspiracy. Ray and Vince have turned state's evidence, Taylor announced as evening approached. Apparently, they drew the line at killing Frank. They've provided detailed statements about their role in forcing his vehicle off the road. And Donovan, Jack asked. The sheriff is cooperating, fully claiming Bennett misled him. His future depends on how convincing federal prosecutors find that story. Taylor's expression suggested he wasn't optimistic about Donovan's chances. Bill Harmon, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. I've been asked to serve as interim sheriff until special elections can be held. Despite his illness, there was new energy in the former lawman's voice. Might not have much time left, but I can at least help set things right. Michael, who had been quietly supportive throughout the day, finally spoke. What about my father's death? Will they be charged with murder? Taylor exchanged glances with Jack before answering carefully. The evidence strongly suggests Frank Miller was killed to prevent him from exposing the operation. Bennett and several associates will face conspiracy and murder charges based on the documentation you have provided and physical evidence from the accident scene. Margaret reached for her son's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Frank would be proud of you, of all of us. As night fell over Riverdale, the small town buzzed with the unprecedented events of the day. Bennett, the powerful businessman who had controlled local politics and economics for decades, was in federal custody. His network of influence was unraveling as associates scrambled to distance themselves from the expanding investigation. Jack stood outside the municipal building, watching as lights came on across the town. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a sense of completion, of promises finally fulfilled. Taylor joined him, offering a cup of coffee. You should know we found human remains at an abandoned section of the mine property. Forensics will confirm, but the initial assessment suggests they've been there approximately 6 weeks. Jack absorbed this confirmation of Eddie's fate with solemn acknowledgement. He deserves a proper burial, military honors. Already arranged, Taylor assured him. His service record will be amended to reflect his continued operations and ultimate sacrifice. They stood in companionable silence, two aging men who had carried the weight of their pasts long after others had moved on. What will you do now? Taylor finally asked. After all this is resolved. Jack had asked himself the same question throughout the day. For decades, he'd existed rather than lived, moving from place to place, taking temporary jobs, forming no lasting connections. The mission that had brought him to Riverdale had provided purpose, but its completion left questions about what remained. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought beyond this day for a very long time." Taylor nodded, understanding. "The Bureau could use your skills. Consultant work, perhaps. Your experience with this type of investigation is valuable." Jack considered the offer. "Maybe, but not immediately. There are other matters to attend to first." The following morning brought clearer perspective. Jack met with Margaret and Michael at the diner, which had reopened despite the extraordinary circumstances. The crossroads had become a gathering place for locals seeking information about Bennett's arrest and the federal investigation that had descended on their quiet town. "Business is booming," Margaret observed with grim humor as she joined Jack at a corner booth. "Nothing like a corruption scandal to bring in customers." Jack smiled slightly. "People are processing a significant shift in their understanding of their community. It's natural to seek connection during such times." Michael slid into the booth beside his mother, his young face showing the strain and relief of recent events. "The FBI says they'll be concluding the active investigation phase soon. Most of the agents will be leaving by the end of the week, though the case will continue at the federal level." "And Bennett?" Jack asked. "Transferred to federal custody in Cincinnati. The state charges have been superseded by federal indictments: drug trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, and murder." Jack nodded, satisfied that justice was proceeding. "Have they released Eddie's remains?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "Sarah is arranging a military funeral for next week. She asked if you'd be there." "Of course." Jack paused, considering his next words carefully. "I've been thinking about Frank's legacy, this diner, your future. Bennett's arrest doesn't immediately resolve the financial pressures his actions created." Margaret straightened, pride evident in her bearing. "We'll manage. The bank has already contacted us about restructuring our loan now that Bennett's influence is removed. And business is improving." "I'd like to help," Jack said simply. "Not with money, but with work, if you'll have me." Michael looked surprised. "You want to stay in Riverdale?" "For a while, at least." Jack glanced around the diner at the photographs on the wall, the worn counter where he'd first encountered Margaret, the community that Frank had served faithfully. "Frank believed in this place, in the people here. I'd like to understand why." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "The apartment above the garage is yours for as long as you want it, and we could use help with maintenance around here. Frank always handled those things." It was a simple offer, but Jack recognized its significance. Not charity, but opportunity. A chance to contribute, to belong somewhere after decades of transience. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I'd like that." The conversation shifted to practical matters: repairs needed at the diner, preparations for Sarah's return to normal life, Michael's college aspirations, now that the shadow of Bennett's influence had been lifted. Later that day, Jack rode his motorcycle to the cemetery where Frank was buried. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly maintained grounds as he located the simple headstone. Frank Miller, 1946 and 1984, beloved husband, father, friend he served with honor. Jack stood silently before the grave, memories of their shared past mingling with more recent events. He removed from his pocket the St. Christopher medal Margaret had given him, Frank's protection during countless missions. "Mission accomplished, old friend," he said quietly, placing the medal against the headstone. "Eddie's found, Bennett's finished. Your family's safe." The simple ceremony brought unexpected peace, not the complete resolution of decades of guilt and regret, but a step toward acceptance of what could not be changed, in acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The following spring, on Memorial Day, a special ceremony was held at Riverdale's Veterans Memorial. A new plaque was unveiled honoring Frank Miller and Eddie Thompson. The citation recognized their extraordinary courage and commitment to truth in the face of corruption and danger. The ceremony was attended by veterans from across the state, many learning for the first time about the decades-long fight against corruption that had ended in their quiet Midwestern town. The citation concluded with words that Jack had suggested, words that captured what Frank and Eddie had stood for. They never stopped serving, never stopped fighting for what was right. Their war didn't end when they came home, it just changed battlefields. As the plaque was unveiled, Sarah Thompson stood beside Margaret Miller, two women who had carried the weight of their husbands' missions long after most had forgotten. Jack stood behind them, his hand lightly touching Margaret's shoulder, a silent promise to both the living and the dead. A week later, Eddie Thompson was laid to rest with full military honors. Veterans from across the county attended, many learning for the first time the true story of his service and sacrifice. Jack stood beside Sarah during the ceremony, supporting her as the flag was presented. The rifles fired their salute and taps echoed across the hillside cemetery. "He never lost faith in you," Sarah told Jack afterward, "even when years passed without contact. He believed if the truth ever emerged, you'd be part of making it right." "I wish I'd known he survived," Jack replied, "that he came back." Sarah's expression held no accusation. "You both did what you could in impossible circumstances." He understood that. The funeral reception was held at the Crossroads Diner, now becoming a symbol of community resilience in the aftermath of Bennett's fall. Local business owners, farmers, and workers gathered to honor Eddie and to process collectively the revelations about the corruption that had influenced their town for decades. Jack observed the interactions with interest, noting how the community was already beginning to recalibrate, discussing new leadership for vacant positions, planning economic initiatives not dependent on Bennett's vision for the town. Robert Taylor approached, having attended the funeral in an official capacity. "The investigation is proceeding well," he reported quietly. "Lawrence has agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration. His testimony will solidify the historical aspects of the case." "Good," Jack acknowledged, "though it's the present-day justice that matters most to the people here." Taylor nodded agreement. "The U.S. Attorney believes this case will result in one of the most significant corruption prosecutions in recent memory. Multiple jurisdictions, decades of operation connections to high-level officials. And Frank and Eddie will be recognized for their roles in exposing it." "Absolutely. Their persistence and courage were extraordinary." Taylor hesitated, then continued more personally. "The Bureau's offer still stands when you're ready." Jack appreciated the opportunity but remained non-committal. "I have commitments here for now, promises to keep." As summer transitioned to autumn, Riverdale began healing from Bennett's decades of influence. The Interstate Commerce Project was restructured under federal oversight, with modifications to preserve local businesses and farmland. The Crossroads Diner thrived, becoming a symbol of resilience and continuity. Jack settled into a rhythm of work and quiet recovery. He repaired the diner's aging infrastructure, helped Margaret modernize operations, and occasionally provided guidance to Michael as he prepared for engineering studies at the State University. On a cold February evening 6 months later, Jack stood beside Margaret as Michael received his first semester honors at State University's engineering program. The young man had Frank's intelligence and determination, now thriving away from Bennett's shadow. "He's going to design bridges that last a century," Margaret said proudly as they drove back to Riverdale through gently falling snow. "Frank would be proud," Jack replied, "of both of you." When they reached the farmhouse, Margaret hesitated before leaving the truck. "You know, when Frank first came back after being released, he was lost too. Took him years to find his way back to himself." Jack studied her face in the dashboard light. "How did he manage it?" "One day at a time," she answered simply. "And he wasn't alone." Her hand found his in the darkness, a contact both understood, required no rush, no definition. The next morning, Jack hung the photograph of the three young soldiers in its new place above the diner's counter, finally feeling worthy of his inclusion in the image. The road to redemption continued, but for the first time, Jack Lawson was no longer traveling it alone. In December, with the first snow falling across Riverdale, the federal prosecution of Maxwell Bennett concluded with multiple convictions and a 40-year sentence. The former Judge Lawrence received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy, his testimony helping secure convictions for others in the network. The evening the verdicts were announced, Jack, Margaret, Michael, Sarah, and Bill Harmon gathered at the diner after closing. No formal celebration, simply acknowledgement of a chapter finally concluded. To Frank and Eddie, Harmon proposed raising his coffee cup, who never stopped fighting for truth. They honored the toast silently, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. Later, as the others departed, Jack remained at the counter, studying the photograph of three young soldiers that still hung on the wall himself, Frank and Eddie, before the world changed them all. Margaret joined him, following his gaze to the image. "Sometimes I wonder how different things might have been if you'd all come home together. If there had been no betrayal." Jack considered this alternate history thoughtfully. Different, certainly, but not necessarily better. Frank found purpose here, building something meaningful, raising a family, serving his community. Eddie dedicated himself to exposing corruption that harmed thousands. Even in my wandering, I found my way back here when needed. And now, Margaret asked? Now I honor their example, Jack replied simply, by continuing the mission in my own way. Outside, snow continued falling on Riverdale, covering the town in clean whiteness, obscuring old boundaries and revealing new possibilities. Jack Lawson, who had spent decades running from his past, found himself for the first time looking toward a future with purpose. The road to redemption hadn't ended. Perhaps it never would completely. But Jack had found his direction at last, guided by the examples of brothers in arms who had never stopped fighting for what mattered, even when the battle seemed unwinnable. In that continuation, that commitment to finish what others had started, Jack found something he had thought lost forever after his years of captivity and wandering. Not just purpose, but home.